favorite parable because of the story it tells of God's grace and God's amazing grace. The good news that God brings to us, it's in this story, and it's there for us today, to hear it again today. I wonder if you've ever thought about this before in this story, because this story tends to often upset church people. I'm not sure why, but I've had many, many discussions over my ministry about this parable and how it just isn't fair. And I think it works like this. Have you ever thought about the fact that before the good news was good news, for many people it was bad news? Because they were expecting something and they did not get what they expected. We always like to get what we expected, don't we? In this parable in particular, the way we approach it is so unique and so different. Sometimes I think we expect to get stingy, and then we get generous, and we're not sure how to deal with it. We expect, because of what we've done, to receive unkindness, and we get mercy. It's not what we expected. And often, we want this to happen. We expect to get what we deserve. And even more importantly, we want you to get what you deserve. But instead of that, we get God's ever-wide grace and love. This is an amazing story in Matthew 20. And so sometimes, for some of us, it can seem incredibly unfair. Just read through the story. Is it the way life should work? Is it the way things should be? It just doesn't seem to be fair. We prefer some things from God. We prefer God to be predictable like us. We want to know that when something's done in a certain way, it's always going to be done in a certain way. We expect a system based on our rules. And I've heard it said before that until we're the ones that are not picked for the job, until we're the ones standing by the side of the road still waiting on the job, until we're the one that plays by the rules and still doesn't get ahead, we'll never understand the wideness of God's mercy in this story and the need for God's grace and God's love for everyone. Because we look around and we know certain things in life happen. We know some people do the right thing and they still don't get ahead. And we know other people that do the wrong thing and get ahead, don't we? And so we notice that, and it doesn't seem fair to us. So our system of justice has its limits for us. And then we all have to turn to grace when all else fails, when all that other stuff that we think should work, all the system, all the rules, if we do A, B, and C, we get to go past go. When that doesn't work anymore, then all we have left is grace. And until we've experienced the downside of life, until we've experienced what it's like to be an outcast, until we've experienced what it's like to be downtrodden, to be talked about, until we've experienced that, the full impact of this story of God's grace doesn't hit us. Because we've always been one of those working all day, haven't we? I mean, we were there in the morning. When we were hired, we came on board early, didn't we? And so we can never understand the need for this amazing grace that treats everyone the same. But when we're down and out, when we're on the bottom looking up, when the world is so harsh, when we've messed up, anybody else ever messed up besides me? Or I'm the only one? I mean, when we've messed up and we don't see our way out of a situation, it's grace that comes through. It's grace that matters. You know what grace is for? I know some of you don't understand grace. You probably don't want it. It's okay. Because I know who grace is for. Grace is for me. Because I know I messed up. I know I do things wrong. I need God's grace every day. Some of you may not. That's why you don't think it's fair that I get it. But that's the way God's grace is. It surprises us. It comes around the corner and smacks us in the face when we're not expecting it. You see, that's when grace matters the most, when we're hurting, when we're in pain. When life just doesn't add up and end the way we think it should. One thing about grace is it's pretty messy. It messes up our lives. It messes up fairness. But even in the midst of all of that messiness, it's still pretty beautiful, isn't it? When you need God's grace, you know how beautiful it can be. This is a story today about the generosity of God. I mean, that's the parable. Jesus taught in parables for a reason. He didn't go back into the Old Testament and say, I'm going to speak to you today about Ezekiel 27. He spoke in stories to get his point across, and the stories were to bring out the message so the disciples would get it, so the crowds would get it. And this is a story about amazing generosity. I'm going to give you the story quickly again, but in kind of modern vernacular, because sometimes it's easier to hear. The vineyard owner goes out in the morning, and there's a bunch of people there, and he hires them, and he said, if you come to work for me, I'll give you $100 a day. And he goes back at 9 o'clock and says, hey, you need a job? Come on, I'll give you $100 a day. And he does the same thing at noon and at 3 and 5 o'clock, an hour before closing time. He comes in and he says, you need a job? Come on, I'll give you $100 for the rest of the day. That's no way to run a business, is it? I mean, God would go broke running a business that way. But that's the way God works. You see, it's not really a story about a vineyard. It's not really a story about any kind of a business owner. It's a story about God's amazing grace. And in the story, the full-day workers, they became resentful, didn't they? They got what God promised them, but they still became resentful. I wonder what the accountants felt like. How do you keep track of that? All these time cards are for different hours, but they all get the same pay. That doesn't seem right. And the landowner's actions in this story show craziness. They show absurd behavior. They show bad business. They show God's grace. Because God's grace is bad business. It is absurd and it is crazy if you set your life up on rules and not on God's grace. If you set your relationship up with God on following the rules instead of accepting God's grace, you can never follow enough rules to follow God the right way. I mean, the Jews tried it. It didn't work. We need this grace, this love that's poured out for us and on us. This is a parable about God's excessive grace. God's desire to give and to give. No wonder it makes us mad sometimes. Just like the elder son in the story of the prodigal son. It's not supposed to work this way. I stayed here, I worked, I'm supposed to get more. This story upsets more church people than you could ever imagine. I've had people say to me in Sunday school class, well, this means that if somebody comes to God and says they want to believe in God on their deathbed, they get in. I said, that's what it means. But it's not fair. They could be lying. I said, maybe God would know the difference. I don't know. I think God would. But you see, that's not what really upsets us. It upsets us that we've come to church since we were brought by our parents and baptized in front of the church, and yet we don't get any more than the person who walks in right today. That's not the way real life's supposed to work. No, it's not, and it isn't, and it doesn't. Because it's not about that. It's not fair. I'll guarantee you it's not fair. It's grace. That's what it is. It's God's grace. This is a story about people in need, about God's willingness to meet all of our needs wherever we are at. It's about God's willingness to never give up on us. I mean, did you notice that? I mean, did the landowner have any reason to go back into town over and over and over again? No. But that's what God does. God never gives up on us. God's always willing to accept us. God just continues to seek us out. And it's a story about value. In the end, it's not about the unfairness of pay. I mean, that's not really what it's about. It's not even about the generosity. It's not even one of those things that make the other workers the angriest. It's about the fact that full-day workers feel they're being denied a bonus. They've been there all day, haven't they? It's this sense of privilege that we can get when we're the first ones hired. It can be this sense of privilege we get when we're the first ones in the door, when we've been in church our whole lives, aren't we entitled to more? And it's a story that reminds us that it's not. This sense of privilege, I've always thought, this is one of the things that's true in the church. It's an entitlement that sometimes we feel. It's what makes some people in the church crotchety. I love that word. Now, we don't have any crotchety people in this church. But I've read about churches with crotchety people. Churches with people that feel like they're entitled. And they're going to tell you they're entitled. And they're going to tell you the way it should be. Because they have a sense of privilege. And they miss the point of God's amazing grace. The wideness of God's love and mercy for everyone, and everyone by God is treated the same way. So what does this mean for us? Here's the amazing thing about parables, that Jesus always told them, now what this means for us, disciples, what does this mean for us today? Well, it means a couple of things. What does it mean for the church today? How do we approach everyone else in the church? How do we approach people that walk in the door for the first time? How do we approach people that come back after being gone for years? How do we approach them? Are we sticking with the church? Do we understand the importance of that? I mean, we know, we've heard the surveys, we've talked about it in sermons, of all these young people that want nothing to do with the church. What does it mean for the church today? Are you willing to stick it out? You've heard me mention before Tony Campolo. And he's a great leader and a great teacher. And he grew up in an American Baptist church in Philadelphia. And he told this story when I heard him one time. And he said, yes, he says, I go to a black church. He said, now, it wasn't black when I started going there. But it was an inner city church and it changed and it became black. And when we were kids, we used to say to our dad, well, why don't we go out where everybody else is going? Why don't we go out to the suburbs where everybody else is? And my dad would always say, my parents gave those collection plates and we're not going without them. A sense of understanding the importance of the church, of staying in the church, of being with the church. That's one thing it means for us today. But what about the future church? I had a great discussion just a week ago, and I've said, the church morphs, and it's morphing at a much rapider pace, just like society and knowledge and technology are. And in the late 1800s, most of the churches in this country were small churches and scattered throughout towns. And growing up in the Midwest, I said, I lived in a town of 300 people with 2 Methodist churches. I mean, that's the way it was. That's the way it was for a long time. And then there was this move to the city. And we became these big cathedral churches, and this was one of them. And they were scattered across this country in bigger cities. And they worshiped a lot of people. And then since that time, 40 years later, we've morphed into this mega church setup. And we always think, oh, that's the way to do it. It's going to be here. No, I got to guarantee you, it won't be here in 40 years. It won't be here. There'll be something else. And the way things are speeding up, it may not take 40 years. It may be 30 years or 20 years. But things are changing in the church. So we have to be grace-filled and understand that. One of the people I talked to said, he wasn't sure the church would be here in 40 years. And he meant the church. What do you think about that? It's up to us. It's up to us. If we could get to all those young people out there, and all those young people that don't want to come because they see no grace in the church, if we could get them in, the church will thrive. The church will have a rebirth. There's always something God can do. And God can continue to do it, but we need to do the work. If those young people see us and they see us as hypocrites, and they see us as judgmental and all those things we've talked about, why would they want to come? What if we were to say, oh no, we are full of grace. Come and receive God's love, God's mercy, God's forgiveness, not only from God, but from the church, from this church, from our church. You see, for us, this parable says a lot about how we see God. How do you see God? As a ruler beating over you and saying, don't break a rule, or as a grace-filled God that knows you've already broken so many, that's not going to work. It says a lot about how we live our lives as people of God. And sometimes it just takes recognizing one thing. You may not think this way, but if God is the God of eternity, my understanding, eternity is a long, long time. Would you agree? Well, on the scope of eternity, guess who the people are that were hired at 5 o'clock? Yes, that's me and that's you. You see, the church has been around a lot longer than us, and we're the last ones in the door. So are we going to keep opening the doors and inviting others in, or are we going to keep them away because it just doesn't seem fair that they get God's grace too? We need to recognize we're all dependent upon God's grace. When we do that, we can live with a sense of gratitude. Instead of pushing people away, instead of saying, I'm in, you're out, instead of saying, I'm on this level and you're on this level, we're just so grateful for God's grace, we share it with others. And that is so important. Instead of looking for the rights we're entitled to, all live dependent upon God. I don't know how many of you have been to Israel? Not very many. You should go. I've been there a couple times. One of the amazing things is that the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea, and the Jordan River flows out of the Dead Sea. Well, what's so amazing, around the Jordan River, everywhere, as it goes in, as it comes out both, they use the water for vegetation, for life. But the Dead Sea is, in fact, when I was there, I heard this statistic that the Great Salt Lake has chemicals at about 3%. The Dead Sea is about 34% chemicals. So that's why people can float on it. They just can float on it forever. But one of the things is, it stays dead. And it's not has any life, but the water coming in and the water going out of life. And so I thought today, what a great parable for us. What a great parable. I mean, God sends life into us through God's Spirit. Now we can choose, the difference between us and the Dead Sea is we can choose how we want to react to that life-giving water that comes into us, that life-giving Spirit of God. And when it goes out of us, we can help it have more life because we believe in it, and we can then be changed. We can be changed and become people of life. Which one are we going to be? That's the question. Who are we going to be as a church? Philip Yancey wrote a book, What's So Amazing About Grace? What a great title. You want to know what's so amazing about grace?